The entertainment was ample and handsome, according to the Scotch ideas of the period, and the guests did great honour to it. The Baron ate like a famished soldier, the Laird of Balmawhapple like a sportsman, Bullsegg of Killincurret like a farmer, Waverley himself like a traveller, and Bailie Macweeble like all four together, though, either out of more respect, or in order to preserve that proper declination of person which showed a sense that he was in the presence of his patron, he sat upon the edge of his chair, placed it 3 feet distance from the table, and achieved a communication with his plate by projecting his person towards it in a line which obliqued from the bottom of his spine, so that the person who sat opposite to him could only see the foretop of his writing periwig. This stooping position might have been inconvenient to another person, but long habit made it, whether seated or walking, perfectly easy to the worthy Bailie. In the latter posture it occasioned, no doubt, an unseemly projection of the person towards those who happened to walk behind, but those being at all times his inferiors, for Mr. Macweeble was very scrupulous in giving place to all others, he cared very little what inference of contempt or slight regard they might derive from the circumstance. Hence, when he waddled across the court to and from his old grey pony, he somewhat resembled a turnspit walking upon its hind legs. The non-juring clergyman was a pensive and interesting old man, with much of the air of a sufferer for conscience' sake. He was one of those who, undeprived, their benefice forsook. For this whim, when the Baron was out of hearing, the Bailie used sometimes gently to rally Mr. Rubrick, upbraiding him with the nicety of his scruples. Indeed, it must be owned, that he himself, though at heart a keen partisan of the exiled family, had kept pretty fair with all the different turns of state in his time, so that Davy Gellatley once described him as a particularly good man, who had a very quiet and peaceful conscience, that never did him any harm. When the dinner was removed, the Baron announced the health of the king, politely leaving to the consciences of his guests to drink to the sovereign de facto or de jure, as their politics inclined. The conversation now became general, and, shortly afterwards, Miss Bradwardine, who had done the honours with natural grace and simplicity, retired, and was soon followed by the clergyman. Among the rest of the party, the wine, which fully justified the encomiums of the landlord, flowed freely round, although Waverley, with some difficulty, obtained the privilege of sometimes neglecting the glass. At length, as the evening grew more late, the Baron made a private signal to Mr. Saunders Saunderson, or, as he facetiously denominated him, Alexander of Alexandro, who left the room with a nod, and soon after returned, his grave countenance mantling with a solemn and mysterious smile, and placed before his master a small oaken casket, mounted with brass ornaments of curious form. The Baron, drawing out a private key, unlocked the casket, raised the lid, and produced a golden goblet of a singular and antique appearance, moulded into the shape of a rampant bear, which the owner regarded with a look of mingled reverence, pride, and delight, that irresistibly reminded Waverley of Ben Jonson's Tom Otter, with his bull, horse, and dog, as that wag wittily denominated his chief carousing cups. But Mr. Bradwardine, turning towards him with complacency, requested him to observe this curious relic of the olden time. "It represents," he said, "the chosen crest of our family, a bear, as ye observe, and rampant, because a good herald will depict every animal in its noblest posture, as a horse salient, a greyhound current, and, as may be inferred, a ravenous animal in active ferociore, or in a voracious, lacerating, and devouring posture. Now, sir, we hold this most honourable achievement by the Wapenbrief, or concession of arms, of Frederick Redbeard, Emperor of Germany, to my predecessor, Godmund Bradwardine, it being the crest of a gigantic Dane, whom he slew in the lists in the Holy Land, on a quarrel touching the chastity of the Emperor's spouse or daughter, tradition saith not precisely which, and thus, as Virgilius hath it. Mutimus Clipios, de nam consignia nobis aptimus. Then for the cup, Captain Waverley, it was wrought by the command of Saint Duthac, Abbot of Aberbrothock, for behoof of another baron of the house of Bradwardine, who had valiantly defended the patrimony of that monastery against certain encroaching nobles. It is properly termed the Blessed Bear of Bradwardine, though old Dr. Doublight used jocosely to call it Ursa Major, and was supposed, in olden Catholic times, to be invested with certain properties of a mystical and supernatural quality. and though I give not in to such an ilia, it is certain it has always been esteemed a solemn standard cup and heirloom of our house, nor is it ever used but upon seasons of high festival, and such I hold to be the arrival of the heir of Sir Everard under my roof, and I devote this draught to the health and prosperity of the ancient and highly to be honoured house of Waverley." During this long harangue, he carefully decanted a cobwebbed bottle of claret into the goblet, which held nearly an English pint, and, at the conclusion, delivering the bottle to the butler, to be held carefully in the same angle with the horizon, he devoutly quaffed off the contents of the blessed bear of Bradwardine. Edward, with horror and alarm, beheld the animal making his rounds, and thought with great anxiety upon the appropriate motto, "Beware the bear," but, at the same time, plainly foresaw that, as none of the guests scrupled to do him this extraordinary honor, a refusal on his part to pledge their courtesy would be extremely ill received. Resolving, therefore, to submit to this last piece of tyranny, and then to quit the table, if possible, and confiding in the strength of his constitution, he did justice to the company and the contents of the blessed bear, and felt less inconvenience from the draught than he could possibly have expected. The others, whose time had been more actively employed, began to show symptoms of innovation. The good wine did its good office. The frost of etiquette and pride of birth began to give way before the genial blessings of this benign constellation, and the formal appellatives with which the three dignitaries had hitherto addressed each other were now familiarly abbreviated into Tully, Bally, and Killy. When a few rounds had passed, the two latter, after whispering together, craved permission, a joyful hearing for Edward, to ask the grace cup. This, after some delay, was at length produced, and Waverley concluded the orgies of Bacchus were terminated for the evening. He was never more mistaken in his life. Southey's Mattock. As the guests had left their horses at the small inn, or change-house, as it was called, of the village, the Baron could not, in politeness, avoid walking with them up the avenue, and Waverley from the same motive, and to enjoy after this feverish revel the cool summer evening, attended the party. But when they arrived at Lucky Macleary's, the lairds of Balmawhapple and Killancureit declared their determination to acknowledge their sense of the hospitality of Tully Veolan by partaking, with their entertainer and his guest Captain Waverley, what they technically called Diacon Dorois, a stirrup cup, to the honour of the Baron's roof-tree. 10. It must be noticed that the Bailey, knowing by experience that the day's jovialty, which had been hitherto sustained at the expense of his patron, might terminate partly at his own, had mounted his spavined grey pony, and, between gaiety of heart and alarm for being hooked into a reckoning, spurred him into a hobbling canter. A trot was out of the question, and had already cleared the village. The others entered the change-house, leading Edward in unresisting submission, for his landlord whispered him that to demur to such an overture would be construed into a high misdemeanour against the leges convivials, or regulations of genial computation. Widow Macleary seemed to have expected this visit, as well she might, for it was the usual consummation of marrybouts, not only at Tully Veolan, but at most other gentlemen's houses in Scotland, 60 years since. The guests thereby at once acquitted themselves of their burden of gratitude for their entertainer's kindness, encouraged the trade of his change-house, did honour to the place which afforded harbour to their horses, and indemnified themselves for the previous restraints imposed by private hospitality, by spending what Falstaff calls the sweet of the night in the genial licence of a tavern. Accordingly, in full expectation of these distinguished guests, Lucky Macleary had swept her house for the first time this fortnight, tempered her turf fire to such a heat as the season required in her damp hovel even at midsummer, set forth her deal table newly washed, propped its lame foot with a fragment of turf, arranged 4 or 5 stools of huge and clumsy form upon the sites which best suited the inequalities of her clay floor, and having, moreover, put on her clean toy, rokelay, and scarlet plaid, gravely awaited the arrival of the company, in full hope of custom and profit. When they were seated under the sooty rafters of Lucky Macleary's only apartment, thickly tapestried with cobwebs, their hostess, who had already taken her cue from the Laird of Balmawhapple, appeared with a huge pewter measuring pot, containing at least 3 English quarts, familiarly denominated a tap-pit hen, and which, in the language of the hostess, reamed, i.e., mantled, with excellent claret just drawn from the cask. It was soon plain that what crumbs of reason the bear had not devoured were to be picked up by the hen, but the confusion which appeared to prevail favored Edward's resolution to evade the gaily circling glass. The others began to talk thick and at once, each performing his own part in the conversation without the least respect to his neighbor. The Baron of Bradwardine sung French chansons à bord, and spouted pieces of Latin. Killancurate talked, in a steady unalterable dull key, of top-dressing and bottom-dressing, and year-olds, and jimmers, and dinmans, and stots, and runts, and kilos, and a proposed turnpike act, while Balmawhapple, in notes exalted above both, extolled his horse, his hawks, and a greyhound called Whistler. In the middle of this din, the Baron repeatedly implored silence, and when at length the instinct of polite discipline so far prevailed that for a moment he obtained it, he hastened to beseech their attention unto a military ariette, which was a particular favourite of the Maréchal Duc de Berwick. Then, imitating, as well as he could, the manner and tone of a French musketeer, he immediately commenced. Mon cœur volage, dit-elle, n'est pas pour vous, garçon, est pour un homme de guerre, qu'à barbomenton. L'on, Laradon. Que porte chapeau à plume, soulier à rouge talon, que joue de la flûte, aussi du violon. L'on, Laradon. This has been censured as an anachronism, and it must be confessed that agriculture of this kind was unknown to the Scotch 60 years since. Balmawhapple could hold no longer, but broke in with what he called a good song, composed by Gibbie Gethroweet, the piper of Cooper, and, without wasting more time, struck up. It's up Glenbarkin's braes I gied, and o'er the bent of Killybraid, and mony a weary cast I made, to quiddle the moorfowl's tail, some queek. This snatch of a ballad was composed by Andrew MacDonald, the ingenious and unfortunate author of Vermonda. The Baron, whose voice was drowned in the louder and more obstreperous strains of Balmawhapple, now dropped the competition, but continued to hum Lon, Laradon, and to regard the successful candidate for the attention of the company with an eye of disdain, while Balmawhapple proceeded. If up a bonny black cock should spring, to whistle him down wi' a slug in his wing, and strap him onto my lunsey string, right seldom would I fail. After an ineffectual attempt to recover the second verse, he sung the first over again, and, in prosecution of his triumph, declared there was more sense in that than in all the dairy-dongs of France, and Fifeshire to the boot of it. The Baron only answered with a long pinch of snuff and a glance of infinite contempt. But those noble allies, the bear and the hen, had emancipated the young laird from the habitual reverence in which he held Bradwardine at other times. He pronounced the claret shilpit, and demanded brandy with great vociferation. It was brought, and now the demon of politics envied even the harmony arising from this Dutch concert, merely because there was not a wrathful note in the strange compound of sounds which it produced. Inspired by her, the Laird of Balmawhapple, now superior to the nods and winks with which the Baron of Bradwardine, in delicacy to Edward, had hitherto checked his entering upon political discussion, demanded a bumper, with the lungs of a stentor, to the little gentleman in black velvet who did such service in 1702, and may the white horse break his neck over a mound of his making. Edward was not at that moment clear-headed enough to remember that King William's fall, which occasioned his death, was said to be owing to his horse stumbling at a molehill, yet felt inclined to take umbrage at a toast which seemed, from the glance of Balmawhapple's eye, to have a peculiar and uncivil reference to the government which he served. But, ere he could interfere, the Baron of Bradwardine had taken up the quarrel. "Sir," he said, "whatever my sentiments tanquam privatus may be in such matters, I shall not tamely endure your saying anything that may impinge upon the honourable feelings of a gentleman under my roof. Sir, if you have no respect for the laws of urbanity, do ye not respect the military oath, the sacramentum militare, by which every officer is bound to the standards under which he is enrolled? Look at Titus Livius, what he says of those Roman soldiers who were so unhappy as exura sacramentum, to renounce their legionary oath, but you are ignorant, sir, alike of ancient history and modern courtesy." "Not so ignorant as ye would pronounce me," roared Balmawhapple. "I ken weel that you mean the solemn league and covenant, but if the Whigs in hell had taken the—" Here the Baron and Waverley both spoke at once, the former calling out, "Be silent, sir." Ye not only show your ignorance, but disgrace your native country before a stranger and an Englishman. And Waverley, at the same moment, entreating Mr. Bradwardine to permit him to reply to an affront which seemed levelled at him personally. But the Baron was exalted by wine, wrath, and scorn above all sublunary considerations. I crave you to be hushed, Captain Waverley, you are elsewhere, peradventure, sui juris foris familiated, that is, and entitled, it may be, to think and resent for yourself, but in my domain, in this poor barony of Bradwardine, and under this roof, which is quasi mine, being held by tacit relocation by a tenant at will, I am in loco parentis to you, and bound to see you scathless. And for you, Mr. Falconer of Balmawhapple, I warn ye, let me see no more aberrations from the paths of good manners. And I tell you, Mr. Cosmo Common Bradwardine of Bradwardine and Tullyveolan, retorted the sportsman in huge disdain, that I'll make a moorcock of the man that refuses my toast, whether it be a crop-eared English wig why a black rib band at his lug, or ane wha deserts his own friends to claw favour why the rats of Hanover. In an instant both rapiers were brandished, and some desperate passes exchanged. Balmawhapple was young, stout, and active, but the Baron, infinitely more master of his weapon, would, like Sir Toby Belch, have tickled his opponent other gates than he did had he not been under the influence of Ursa Major. Edward rushed forward to interfere between the combatants, but the prostrate bulk of the Laird of Killancureit, over which he stumbled, intercepted his passage. How Killancureit happened to be in this recumbent posture at so interesting a moment was never accurately known. Some thought he was about to ensconce himself under the table. He himself alleged that he stumbled in the act of lifting a joint stool, to prevent mischief, by knocking down Balmawhapple. Be that as it may, if readier aid than either his or Waverley's had not interposed, there would certainly have been bloodshed. But the well-known clash of swords, which was no stranger to her dwelling, aroused Lucky MacLeary as she sat quietly beyond the hallan, or earthen partition of the cottage, with eyes employed on Boston's crook the lot, while her ideas were engaged in summing up the reckoning. She boldly rushed in, with the shrill expostulation, "Wad their honours slay in another there, and bring discredit on an honest widow woman's house, when there was a the leland in the country to fight upon," a remonstrance which she seconded by flinging her plaid with great dexterity over the weapons of the combatants. The servants by this time rushed in, and being, by great chance, tolerably sober, separated the incensed opponents, with the assistance of Edward and Killancureit. The latter led off Balmawhapple, cursing, swearing, and vowing revenge against every Whig, Presbyterian, and fanatic in England and Scotland, from John O'Groats to the Land's End, and with difficulty got him to horse. Our hero, with the assistance of Saunders Saunderson, escorted the Baron of Bradwardine to his own dwelling, but could not prevail upon him to retire to bed until he had made a long and learned apology for the events of the evening, of which, however, there was not a word intelligible, except something about the centaurs and the Lapithae.